Welcome back. The issue of the Senkaku Islands has now risen once again. China has flooded the Isles with fishing vessels guarded by Coast Guard cutters. This is a huge escalation coming on the heels of the new cabinet appointed by the Prime Minister last week, Michael.
It was an amazing thing. I received an email. Would you appear on television talking about the Chinese vessels around the Senkakus? I said, what?
What's going on? This was Friday. It happened on Friday. It spilled over on Saturday. 15 vessels on Friday, 230 on Saturday. Sunday it went to 14 or 15. Monday it's 15 again.
Well, but the thing is, they're doing it so cleverly. And when I say they, I mean the Chinese.
Yes.
This is fabulous. They send all these fishing vessels, right? We some of them are probably don't have a single hook on them, but nevertheless they send them all, and then they set along. Because, well, you know, where there are fishing vessels, we have to have the Coast Guard. And it is Chinese territory after all, so it's just okay that we have all these very large Coast Guard ships. Some of them, of course, have cannons on the front. And suddenly they're all around the Senkaku Islands, whereas for almost a year we've had real quiet there.
Right.
Only perfunctory visits by Coast Guard vessels and other kinds of maritime surveillance. Suddenly, an armada arrives.
Right.
What could this possibly be about?
Yeah. You know, the Chinese have been masters at foreign policy and diplomacy for centuries and centuries. They're probably one of the better players. People like to think that the French, since most of the lexicon comes from France, that describes the diplomacy and international relations, but really the Chinese probably are the masters at it. They ran something similar to this about 2 years ago with the coral poaching.
Yeah, it's the same deal. That same thing. Suddenly, there were all these ships in the Ogasawaras, which had suddenly appeared from nowhere, and they were all fishing for coral and strip mining the bottom of the ocean.
And the Japanese
then they disappeared.
They disappeared, but the Japanese response was rather tepid.
Well, that's because that's because they have most of their vessels guarding the Senkakus now, and the Ogasawaras and other areas of Japan are underguarded, so that there was this opportunity. But in this case, I have to take issue in saying that the Chinese are masters of diplomacy. If you're a master of diplomacy, the other side gets the point. But basically, the PRC has a way of trying to get people's attention that really pisses people off.
Right.
I mean, if you look at the post-war era, since 1940, well, since the revolution of 1949, okay? When they have ever wanted to speak to the outside world, they have done so by ridiculously over-the-top aggressive acts. Now, the DPRK sort of does that now in the same way, but the Chinese also have this method of getting people to talk to them after, you know, shelling Quemoyo Matsu or doing something completely outrageous. And here, clearly, they want to talk to the government of Abe Shinzo, particularly about one subject, at least in my opinion, and it's been reflected in commentary inside China. This is nothing to do with the East China Sea. This is all about Japan trying to get in on the dispute in the South China Sea.
Right.
And this is China's way of saying, bug out.
Butt the hell out.
Yes, stay out of that part of the world. It's not your part of the world. And we'll go back to, you know, status quo ante in the East China Sea. If you don't do that, we're going to send all of these vessels, and they're going to be there, and you're going to have to deal with them.
Right. I don't know. I think they're playing to different audiences. I think they're playing to their internal audience as well, but also the fact that Tomomi Inada was appointed as Minister of Defense, that I think triggered this onslaught of all of these fishing vessels just showing up and then disappearing.
Well, that would be an amazing turnaround, and I don't think even people like the Chinese can move an entire government apparatus to respond that quickly. I mean, it's a possibility, but I would probably disagree with you. I would think it has much more to do with China's internal politics. They certainly got very upset in the way that they perceived Japan got involved in the International Tribunal.
Right.
And they created internally, you're right, the internal dynamic of saying that the entire case that the Philippines raised was entirely manufactured and stage managed by Yanai Shunji, who was then the president of the International Court of ITCLOS, and
that's why it doesn't count.
And that doesn't count because a Japanese arranged it. This is all a Japanese plot.
Right.
And they kept pounding away at that message and pounding away at Yanai Shunji, who, in addition to being one of Japan's experts on international maritime law, is also the big-time advisor to Mr. Abe, in that he was the one who wrote the SEC legislation report. He was the chairman of that group. So it was an easy narrative to put out for the Chinese. They put it out, they pounded away at it. It's all a plot. And now look, the Japanese are giving the Philippines Coast Guard vessels. They're giving Coast Guard vessels to the Vietnamese. Stay out of the South China Sea. That's none of your business, is, I think, the Chinese message.
Well, the Japanese also published a defense report, a white paper, one of the largest in history. Much of it focused on the enhanced militarization by China of the South China Seas.
It's now becoming, unfortunately, looking like a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of conflict over either the South China or the East China Seas. Both sides are ramping up the rhetoric. They're putting out more and more reports on it, and it is really changing the atmosphere really quickly. But let's be real. The Chinese have really changed the situation on the open sea. Sending 230 vessels to surround the areas just outside the territorial waters, and then sending a few ships in to upset the Japanese Coast Guard. They have really upped the ante, and it's hard to forgive unless they are really struggling internally to keep a lid on Chinese domestic wishes to have some kind of real knockdown, drag-out fight.
Right. But once again, I think the move was brilliant because nobody was hurt. It was like I'm going to punch you, one of those kinds of numbers. They came in, they flooded the seas, they left. It's kind of like a couple of weeks ago, we had a talk on Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's in China where they were mobbed by people, close down McDonald's, get out of here, you people who are eating here, you are unpatriotic.
Yeah, but in foreign policy circles, they talk about, it's not really a metaphor that I really enjoy. They talk about salami slicing, where you just keep slicing away at what was acceptable before, and then suddenly the salami's gone. Right. In this case, what's being sliced away at? Well, okay, the fishing vessels are there, and these Chinese Coast Guard vessels are boarding these Chinese vessels to inspect them as they engage in fishing, which establishes that those Coast Guard vessels have administrative authority over that area. To which Japan immediately says, no, that's in our economic exclusion zone. You cannot board Chinese vessels. And the Chinese say, why not?
Yes. We're China.
We're China. These are Chinese vessels. We're just trying to help.
Right.
It's a brilliant, and it also just chips away, if you want to say it that way, or slices away at what are supposedly Japan's boundaries.
Well, in the meantime, this island is continuing to be created by the Chinese. More sand is being amassed on the coral reefs.
Oh, the islands that are being developed, they're islands now. Before they were atolls that were sometimes above water, most of the time not. Now we have structures, we have airfields, we have now hangars. That's the latest thing that has just come up.
Tourist ships visiting.
Tourist ship visiting. They've had commercial aircraft land on these places. It's going to be very difficult to march it back. In fact, it's probably impossible. The Chinese do not believe that the current international system will punish them. And after seeing what happened to the Russians in terms of Crimea and the Ukraine, they're probably right.
Or what happened with the International Tribunal. They had an opportunity to hammer home this ruling, and they kind of backtracked on it.
Well, the thing is, who's going to be the force that asserts the countervailing authority to what the Chinese are doing? The Chinese are calculating. They're calculating China very carefully. They're saying, look, the U.S. is willing to work for freedom of navigation, fine, but there's a limit to what they're going to do. And we're going to find out what that limit is. Any modern theorist would say, a theorist of statehood would say that's exactly what they should be doing, and that's exactly what they will do.
Right. 230 Chinese vessels swamped the Senkaku Islands as a show of force. Who knows what that means for international diplomacy between the two nations? But you can be sure this is not the end of the story. Stay tuned for more.